A child was caught sneaking food out of a grocery store. But when the owner followed him, he discovered a heartbreaking truth. The air inside the abandoned car was damp and cold, carrying the unmistakable staleness of a place long past its prime. The rusted vehicle sat forgotten in an empty lot, surrounded by weeds that crept like silent witnesses to its decay. Inside, 12-year-old Daniel clutched a threadbare blanket tightly around his younger brother, Lucas. At only 6 years old, Lucas's pale face rested against Daniel's shoulder, his breathing light and steady. He was finally asleep, though Daniel's racing mind wouldn't allow him the same escape. It had been 6 months since their lives had been turned upside down. 6 months since the accident that took their parents from them and left the brothers to fend for themselves. At first, they had stayed with their aunt, a woman whose kindness was buried beneath the crushing weight of her own struggles. After a few weeks of strained hospitality, she had grown distant, eventually telling Daniel there wasn't enough money or space for 2 more mouths to feed. One morning, they woke up to find themselves left outside the shelter, a single duffel bag packed with their clothes. Daniel had tried everything since then. He had begged on street corners, searched dumpsters for anything edible, and even worked odd jobs when strangers were kind enough to offer them. But the world was unforgiving, especially for 2 kids trying to navigate it alone. As the nights grew colder, the fight to survive became more desperate. Now the car was their home, a prison of rust and shattered glass. It provided little warmth and even less safety, but it was all they had. Daniel had promised himself that he would protect Lucas no matter what. Every time his brother looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, Daniel felt the weight of that promise settle heavier on his shoulders. Tonight, however, there was no food left. The crackers they'd shared the night before were long gone, and Lucas's weak, whispered complaints about his empty stomach replayed endlessly in Daniel's mind. "I'll get something," Daniel muttered to himself, determination stealing his voice. "I have to." Wrapping Lucas more tightly in the blanket, Daniel stepped out of the car and into the cold night. His breath puffed in small, visible clouds as he made his way toward the grocery store a few blocks away. He didn't know exactly how he would get the food, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't go back empty-handed. Daniel's stomach churned as he approached the small grocery store, its fluorescent lights glowing like a beacon in the dimness of the street. The sign above the door read Carter's Groceries, the paint slightly faded but still inviting enough to promise warmth and food inside. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, before pushing the door open. A soft chime announced his entrance. The warmth inside hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the icy night outside. Shelves lined with colorful packages and neatly stacked produce surrounded him, an overwhelming abundance of food that felt almost cruel in its unattainability. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the aisles. A woman in a scarf browsed the canned goods. A couple chatted quietly near the coffee display, and behind the counter stood a man, broad-shouldered with salt and pepper hair, ringing up a customer's purchases. Daniel's heart pounded as he moved toward the bread aisle, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold. It wasn't the first time he'd done this, but it never got easier. The risk always felt too big, the stakes too high. Yet Lucas's face flashed in his mind, his small, hopeful voice asking, "Do you think we'll have something warm tomorrow?" Daniel swallowed hard, pushing the guilt aside. He reached for a loaf of bread, his movements deliberate yet trembling. The soft, fresh smell filled his nose as he slipped it inside his hoodie. He glanced around. No one seemed to notice. Encouraged, he added a packet of crackers, carefully tucking it away. Just as he turned to leave, a voice stopped him cold. "Hey, kid." Daniel froze. His heart dropped into his stomach as he turned to see the man behind the counter, Mr. Carter, watching him intently. Daniel's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and his body chose flight. Without thinking, he bolted toward the door, the chime ringing loudly as he pushed it open and sprinted into the night. "Wait," the man called after him, but Daniel didn't stop. He ran as fast as his legs would carry him, weaving through alleyways and cutting corners until the lights of the grocery store were a distant memory. Panting, he finally slowed down, his chest heaving. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. He'd gotten away. He reached into his hoodie to check the bread and crackers, his lifeline for Lucas tonight. But as he turned a corner, a shadow moved behind him. A voice, calm but firm, echoed in the quiet alley. "Kids, stop running. I just want to talk." Daniel whipped around, his heart hammering again. Standing a few feet away, with his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture, was Mr. Carter. Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he was sure the man could hear it. He took a step back, clutching the bread and crackers through his hoodie as if they were a shield. His wide, fearful eyes darted to the alley's exit, calculating the chances of escaping. "Hey, take it easy," Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but steady. He kept his distance, sensing the boy's panic. "I'm not here to hurt you or call the cops. I just want to talk." "Leave me alone," Daniel said sharply, his voice cracking. His hands shook as he edged further into the shadows of the alley. "I didn't do anything." Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "Look, I know things are tough," he said, his tone softening. "But stealing isn't the answer. Why don't you let me help you?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh, though it sounded more like a sob. "Help? You're not here to help. You're just here to take this back." He patted his hoodie, his eyes flashing with defiance. "Well, you can't. It's mine now." Mr. Carter sighed, crossing his arms as he leaned casually against the wall. "I'm not here to take anything, kid. If you need food, you could have just asked." Daniel's face hardened, a flicker of anger breaking through his fear. "Asked," he repeated, his voice rising. "You think it's that simple. People don't just give you things, not when you're nobody. Not when you don't have anything to give back." The words hung in the air, raw and honest, cutting deeper than Mr. Carter had expected. He didn't respond right away, instead studying the boy in front of him, too thin, too tired, and far too old for his years. "What's your name?" Mr. Carter asked after a pause, his voice quiet. Daniel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay silent. But something about the man's steady gaze made him falter. "Daniel," he mumbled, barely audible. "Daniel," Mr. Carter repeated. "All right, I'll tell you what. Keep the food. It's yours. But I need to know, why are you out here all alone?" Daniel's body tensed, his mind racing. He wanted to run, to lie, to say anything to make this man leave him alone. But the weight of the past months pressed down on him, and suddenly his voice betrayed him. "I'm not alone," he muttered, looking down at the cracked pavement. "My little brother, he's waiting for me." Mr. Carter's brow furrowed. "Your brother?" Daniel nodded, gripping the stolen food tighter. We don't have anyone else. I had to get something for him. He's hungry. He's always hungry." The raw pain in Daniel's voice hit Mr. Carter like a punch to the gut. He straightened, his arms falling to his sides. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and the picture they painted was devastating. "Where is he?" Mr. Carter asked gently. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his defenses snapping back into place. "Why do you care?" "Because," Mr. Carter said, taking a careful step forward, "I know what it's like to feel like the world's turned its back on you. And I know it's not easy to trust anyone when you're just trying to survive. But I swear, I'm not here to make things worse for you or your brother." Daniel stared at him, torn between mistrust and the faint, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this man meant what he said. Daniel stayed frozen, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He didn't trust adults. He'd learned the hard way that they either wanted something in return or didn't stick around when things got hard. Yet there was something in Mr. Carter's voice, a gentleness that felt foreign but sincere. Still, Daniel couldn't let his guard down. "You don't know anything about us," Daniel said, his tone sharp, though his voice wavered. "We're fine. We don't need your help." Mr. Carter let out a slow breath, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "You're right. I don't know what you've been through. But I do know you're not fine, Daniel. Look at yourself." He gestured lightly toward the boy's too thin frame and the dark circles under his eyes. "And if you're trying this hard to protect your brother, I'm guessing he's not fine either." Daniel flinched at the words, his defenses crumbling just a little. He's okay. I'm taking care of him." "How?" Mr. Carter pressed, his tone still kind but insistent. "By stealing bread and crackers? That's not enough, Daniel, not for two growing kids." The boy clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening as he fought to hold back tears. "I'm doing the best I can. You don't get it." "I don't," Mr. Carter admitted, his voice softening. "But I want to, and I want to help. You don't have to keep doing this on your own." Daniel shook his head furiously, stepping back. "Help? Like what? Put us in some foster home where they'll split us up? No way. I'm not letting anyone take Lucas." The fierce protectiveness in his voice was unmistakable, and it struck a chord in Mr. Carter. He realized this wasn't just about survival for Daniel. It was about keeping the one piece of family he had left. "All right," Mr. Carter said after a pause, lowering his voice as if speaking to a cornered animal. "No one's taking him away. I promise you that. But I can't just walk away from this. Look, I have a spare room at my place. It's not much, but it's warm, and there's food. You and Lucas can stay, just until you figure something out." Daniel blinked, stunned into silence. Of all the responses he'd expected, this wasn't one of them. "You just let us live with you?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Mr. Carter shrugged. "I live alone. The house is too quiet anyway. And honestly, I'd sleep a lot better knowing you two aren't freezing out here in some alley or wherever it is you're staying." Daniel's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. The idea of sleeping somewhere warm, of Lucas having a real meal for once, tugged at his resolve. Yet the thought of trusting this man, of letting their fragile hidden world be exposed, terrified him. "What's the catch?" Daniel finally asked, his voice cold and suspicious. "No catch," Mr. Carter replied, meeting his gaze. "Just a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. You don't owe me anything. But if you don't believe me," he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card, holding it out. "Here, my number and address. Take it. If you ever decide you want help, you'll know where to find me." Daniel didn't move at first, his mind racing. Finally, he reached out hesitantly, snatching the card as if it might burn him. "Think about it, kid," Mr. Carter said, stepping back. "And don't worry about the food, it's yours. Good luck, Daniel." With that, Mr. Carter turned and walked back down the alley, leaving Daniel standing in the cold, clutching the stolen bread and crackers in one hand and the business card in the other. Daniel didn't move for what felt like an eternity, standing alone in the alley with Mr. Carter's card clutched in his hand. The air was cold and biting, but it wasn't the chill that made him shiver, it was the impossible choice weighing on him. He glanced down at the card, its edges soft in the dim light of the flickering street lamp. The address and phone number were written neatly in bold letters, like a lifeline he didn't ask for. He stuffed it into his hoodie pocket and turned toward the lot where the abandoned car waited, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. When he reached the rusted vehicle, the sight of Lucas asleep in the back seat made his throat tighten. His little brother was curled up under their blanket, his small body barely taking up any space on the torn seat. Daniel slid to the front, quietly closing the door behind him. Lucas stirred, rubbing his eyes groggily. "Danny," he mumbled, his voice soft and fragile. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, forcing a smile as he turned around. He pulled the bread and crackers out of his hoodie and held them up. "Look what I got us." Lucas's face lit up at the sight of the food. "Really? We get to eat tonight?" Daniel nodded, ignoring the knot in his stomach. "Yeah, we're good." He broke the bread in half, handing the bigger piece to Lucas. As his little brother devoured it, Daniel took small bites of his own portion, trying to make it last. But as he chewed, his mind wouldn't stop replaying the conversation with Mr. Carter. A spare room. Food. Warmth. It sounded like everything they needed, yet it also felt like a trap. What if it wasn't real? What if they ended up somewhere worse? "Danny." Lucas's quiet voice snapped him back to the present. "Yeah. Do you think Mom and Dad can see us?" Lucas whispered, his big eyes glimmering in the dark. Daniel froze. He opened his mouth to speak, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. He finally nodded. "Yeah, Lou. I think they can." Lucas smiled faintly and lay back down, clutching the blanket to his chest. "Then we'll be okay," he murmured before drifting back to sleep. Daniel sat in silence, staring at his brother. He couldn't fail him. He wouldn't. Reaching into his pocket, his fingers brushed against Mr. Carter's card. For the first time, he let himself consider it. Maybe this was the break they needed. The sun was barely rising when Daniel woke to the sound of Lucas's soft, uneven breaths. The car was colder than usual, frost creeping along the windows like delicate spiderwebs. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, though the ache in his stomach outweighed the chill. Daniel glanced at Lucas, still wrapped in a blanket. His face was pale, his cheeks hollow. It hit Daniel like a punch. Lucas was getting thinner. He hadn't noticed it before, but now he couldn't unsee it. The weight of their situation pressed harder than ever. He had no plan, no options. The stolen bread and crackers had been a temporary solution, but it wouldn't last. What would he do tomorrow? Next week? Reaching into his hoodie, Daniel pulled out the card Mr. Carter had given him. The name and address stared back at him, almost mocking in its simplicity. Could it really be this easy? Just show up and have someone care enough to help? His instincts screamed no. The world didn't work like that. But then he looked at Lucas again. He didn't have the luxury of mistrust anymore. His brother's life depended on him, and he was running out of time. Daniel stuffed the card back into his pocket, carefully climbed out of the car, and stood in the crisp morning air. His breath came out in visible puffs as he paced, his mind wrestling with the choice in front of him. Finally, he stopped, staring down at his shoes. All right, he muttered to himself, steeling his nerves. We'll try. He opened the car door and gently shook Lucas awake. Hey, buddy. Come on, we're leaving. Lucas groaned, rubbing his eyes. Where are we going? To a house, Daniel said hesitantly, his voice uncertain. A guy I met, he said we could stay for a little while. Lucas sat up, blinking sleepily. A house? Really? Daniel nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, but only for a bit. Just until I figure things out, okay? Lucas didn't ask questions. He never did. He simply nodded, trust etched into his young face. Okay, Danny. Daniel helped Lucas out of the car, draping the blanket over his shoulders. Together, they began the long walk toward the address on the card. With each step, Daniel's heart raced faster. He didn't know what they would find when they got there. All he knew was that for the first time in months, he had made a choice to hope. The house wasn't what Daniel expected. When he and Lucas reached the address, they found a modest two-story home with a small porch and neatly trimmed bushes out front. It wasn't flashy or overly large, but it looked safe. The morning sunlight reflected off the windows, and a faint wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth inside. Daniel hesitated at the gate, gripping Lucas's hand tightly. His heart pounded as doubt flooded his mind. What if this was a mistake? What if Mr. Carter had changed his mind or didn't mean what he said? Danny, Lucas whispered, tugging at his arm. Daniel took a deep breath and nodded, forcing himself to move. Let's go. They walked up the path, their worn shoes crunching on the gravel. When they reached the door, Daniel raised his hand to knock, but his nerves got the better of him. He pulled his fist back, trembling slightly. Do you think he's nice? Lucas asked, looking up at his brother with wide eyes. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. I hope so. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and there stood Mr. Carter. He wore a sweater and jeans, his expression neutral at first, until his eyes landed on the boys. His face softened immediately. You came, he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Daniel nodded stiffly, gripping Lucas's shoulder protectively. We didn't know where else to go. Mr. Carter stepped back, holding the door open. Come in. It's freezing out here. Daniel hesitated, glancing back at Lucas, who was shivering beneath the blanket. With a quiet sigh, he led his brother inside. The warmth hit them instantly. The house smelled of fresh coffee and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon. The living room was simple but cozy, with a worn couch, a fireplace crackling softly, and a cluttered coffee table. It felt strange, almost too normal. You can sit down, Mr. Carter said, gesturing to the couch. I'll grab some breakfast. You look like you haven't eaten in a while. Daniel bristled slightly at the comment but said nothing, guiding Lucas to sit. Lucas, however, didn't hold back. Do you have pancakes? He asked, his voice hopeful. Mr. Carter chuckled. I think I can manage that. As he disappeared into the kitchen, Daniel sat stiffly, his eyes scanning the room. Every instinct told him to stay on guard, but Lucas had already relaxed, swinging his legs as he gazed at the fire. Do you think we'll get to stay? Lucas whispered. Daniel didn't answer right away, his jaw tightening. I don't know. We'll see. When Mr. Carter returned with 2 plates of pancakes, the sight made Daniel's stomach ache with hunger. He set the plates on the table, along with a small bottle of syrup. Dig in, Mr. Carter said, taking a seat in the armchair across from them. Lucas didn't need to be told twice. He tore into the pancakes with enthusiasm, syrup dripping down his chin. Daniel, however, hesitated, watching Mr. Carter warily. Why are you doing this? Daniel finally asked, his voice blunt. Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Because you need it. No kid should have to live the way you two have been living. Daniel stared at him, searching for a catch. But for the first time in months, he didn't sense judgment or pity, just genuine kindness. And that terrified him more than anything. Over the next few days, Daniel and Lucas stayed with Mr. Carter, though Daniel never fully let his guard down. He kept an eye on everything, where Mr. Carter went, how he spoke to Lucas, even how he cooked their meals. Trust didn't come easily, but slowly, cracks began to form in the walls Daniel had built around himself. It wasn't one grand gesture that did it, but the quiet, consistent kindness that Mr. Carter showed them. He never asked prying questions, never forced them to explain their past. Instead, he offered small comforts, clean clothes, warm meals, and a place to sleep that wasn't filled with the bitter cold of the streets. One evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch, Daniel found himself sitting across from Mr. Carter at the dining table. A steaming mug of cocoa sat in front of him, untouched. "Why us?" Daniel asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, cautious. "Why would you help two kids you don't even know?" Mr. Carter set down the newspaper he'd been reading, his eyes meeting Daniel's. For a moment, he didn't respond, as if choosing his words carefully. "When I was a kid," Mr. Carter began, his voice calm, "I didn't have much either. My mom worked 2 jobs, and we barely scraped by. One winter, when things were really bad, a neighbor noticed. He started leaving food on our porch. Just little things, a bag of apples, some bread, but it got us through." Daniel frowned, unsure where the story was going. Mr. Carter continued, "I never forgot that. Someone who didn't owe us anything helped us, just because they could. I always told myself that if I ever had the chance, I'd do the same for someone else." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "And then I met you." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He stared down at the mug, his fingers tightening around it. "But we don't deserve this," he muttered. "Of course you do," Mr. Carter said firmly. "Everyone deserves a little help when they need it. Especially you and Lucas. You've done everything you can to keep him safe. That's more than most adults would do." The sincerity in his voice struck a chord in Daniel. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his shoulders lightened, just a little. That night, as he lay on the pull-out bed in Mr. Carter's guest room, Daniel stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Maybe this wasn't permanent. Maybe they'd have to leave someday. But for now, Lucas was safe, warm, and fed. And for the first time in months, Daniel let himself believe that things could get better. In the weeks that followed, the bond between them grew. Mr. Carter helped Daniel enroll Lucas in school and even found a job for Daniel at the store. It wasn't easy. Daniel still had moments of doubt, of fear that it could all be taken away. But step by step, they began to rebuild the life they'd lost. The day Lucas came home from school with a drawing he'd made, a picture of the 3 of them standing in front of the little house, Daniel realized something. For the first time in what felt like forever, they had a place to call home. Enjoyed this story? Don't miss out on more heartfelt tales. Subscribe now and join us for more stories that inspire, move, and captivate.